In 1943, at the height of World War II, the United States embarked on a secret scientific project that promised to change the course of the war. Known as the Philadelphia Experiment, the goal was to make the destroyer USS Eldridge invisible to enemy radars. However, what happened that day went far beyond what was expected. Disappearance, teleportation, and terrible physical consequences for the crew created one of the greatest mysteries in American military history. Get ready to dive into this enigma. It was the peak of World War II. In 1943, the United States was deeply involved in the global conflict. The war was being fought on multiple fronts, and the country's military strength was tested daily. The success or failure of military operations could mean victory or defeat. Faced with this, the U.S. government desperately sought ways to innovate and secure an advantage over its enemies. The United States Navy, one of the most powerful forces in the world, was aware of the challenges it would face in naval battles. The German fleet, known for its devastating submarine operations, posed a real threat. To counter this, American scientists were developing cutting-edge technologies that could offer a strategic advantage. Among them, a secret project emerged, a way to make ships invisible to enemy radar. The idea was simple in theory, but challenging in execution. Use electromagnetic fields to deflect radar waves, thereby concealing ships. If successful, this could change the course of naval warfare. No one would see what was about to happen, and the American Navy could attack undetected. To many, this seemed like science fiction. However, some of the best scientists in the world were involved, including allegedly figures like Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein, who were said to have contributed to the theories underlying the project. The project was codenamed Project Rainbow, and a ship was chosen to test this technology, the destroyer USS Eldridge. The Eldridge was a modern ship, equipped with the most advanced military technology of the time. For the crew, however, what was about to happen was a mystery. Few knew the details of the experiment. Many simply followed orders without fully understanding the risks involved. With preparations complete and scientists confident in their calculations, the experiment was scheduled. The USS Eldridge was docked at the Philadelphia shipyards, ready for the test that could change history. There was a sense of tension in the air. Something big was about to happen, and those involved knew that success or failure was not just a scientific matter, but a matter of national security. While the government kept everything secret, rumors began to circulate among those closest to the project. What could happen if science were pushed beyond its limits? Were they toying with forces they didn't fully understand? The Navy had no such concerns. For them, this was just another weapon in the fight against the Axis. As the date of the experiment approached, the tension grew, and everyone was about to witness something never seen before. The USS Eldridge, a newly built escort destroyer, was at the center of one of the most ambitious and risky scientific projects ever imagined. It had been designed to protect naval convoys from German submarines, but now its mission was different. The Navy had chosen it to test a secret technology that, in theory, could make it invisible to radar. To achieve this, the Eldridge was equipped with special generators and high-voltage cables wrapped around its hull, devices intended to create an electromagnetic field around the ship. Preparations began weeks before the experiment. The scientists involved worked day and night to ensure everything was ready. Names of great minds were associated with the project, including Albert Einstein himself, whose unified field theories formed the foundation for the technology to be tested. Although there are no official records confirming his direct involvement, the mere idea that such theories were at play added a layer of mystery and fascination to the endeavor. The crew of the USS Eldridge, however, didn't fully understand what they were getting into. For many of the sailors aboard, this was just another military experiment, a new technology that needed testing to aid the war effort. They had been informed of the project's intentions, but they were unaware of the potential risks. As the day of the experiment approached, an increasing sense of unease spread among the crew. No one knew for sure what would happen. The ship's preparation was meticulous. Generators were installed in strategic areas of the hull, connected to cables that wrapped the Eldridge like an electrical web. The control room, located deep within the ship, would be the experiment's command center. From there, the scientists and engineers would monitor the results, adjusting the frequencies and controlling the intensity of the magnetic field. Rumors began circulating among the sailors and shipyard workers. Some said the ship was being prepared to disappear completely, while others claimed it would be able to teleport to another point in the ocean. The truth, however, was that no one knew for sure what the effects of such technology on a large scale would be. As the date of the experiment approached, additional layers of secrecy were imposed on the project. Orders came directly from the Navy's high command, and the instructions were clear. Any failure could not be disclosed. The American government had a vested interest in maintaining absolute control over the information, ensuring that in the case of success, the enemies would never know what the United States was capable of. The scientists involved in the project were also anxious. Though confident in their theories, they knew they were dealing with forces they barely understood. The concept of manipulating magnetic fields on such a large scale was unprecedented. And although the science behind the idea was sound, the unknown loomed over them. Would they be able to control the effects? Would there be unforeseen consequences? The crew continued their preparations with discipline, while the engineers completed the cable connections and fine-tuned the generators. The USS Eldridge was ready. Now, everything depended on the day of execution. The calculations had been made, and the generators tested. Everything pointed to the experiment's success. However, what was at stake was not just a technological breakthrough, but the safety of dozens of lives. The day of the experiment was set. The final orders were given, and everyone prepared for what would come next. Soon, the USS Eldridge would sail into uncharted waters, where science and the unknown would collide in a moment that would forever change the perception of what was possible. The day had finally arrived. On October 28, 1943, the USS Eldridge was anchored at the Philadelphia shipyards, surrounded by an atmosphere of mystery and anticipation. The crew, anxious and suspicious, had received their orders: remain at their posts and follow the instructions of the engineers and scientists. Everything was ready. The experiment that promised to change the course of the war was about to be tested. Early in the morning, scientists, technicians, and high-ranking officers began to gather at the control center. The silence in the air was palpable. There was no room for error. The government was closely monitoring the project, and any failure could compromise months of planning. No one knew exactly what to expect, but the feeling was that the experiment would transcend the boundaries of known science. The USS Eldridge was covered in cables and generators, each positioned according to precise calculations. At 9 o'clock, the final preparations were complete. The scientists were ready to activate the equipment that would generate the electromagnetic field around the ship. They hoped not only that the ship would disappear from radar, but also somehow become completely invisible to the human eye. The control room was crowded, and all eyes were on the monitors and graphs that would indicate whether the experiment was successful. At 9:15, the command was given. The generators were activated, and the electromagnetic field began to grow in intensity around the USS Eldridge. Witnesses reported that a strange greenish-blue mist began to form around the ship, enveloping it like a curtain of light. The air seemed charged with static, and the sense that something monumental was about to happen was almost tangible. Within minutes, the unexpected occurred. The USS Eldridge simply vanished, not just from the radar, but from the sight of everyone observing the experiment. The ship disappeared completely, leaving no trace behind. At the shipyard, scientists and officers were stunned. The atmosphere was one of disbelief. Initially, there was celebration, as the experiment's goals seemed to have been achieved. But as the minutes dragged on, panic began to creep in. Minute after minute, the ship did not return. Communications with the crew had ceased, and the tension began to turn into fear. For the scientists, this was an event beyond any prediction. They knew that manipulating electromagnetic fields on such a scale was risky, but nothing had prepared them for what was happening. There was growing concern that something terrible had occurred. Meanwhile, reports began to surface that the USS Eldridge had been spotted in Norfolk, Virginia, more than 200 miles away. Witnesses claimed that the ship had mysteriously appeared in the port for a few minutes, shrouded in the same greenish-blue mist, before disappearing again as suddenly as it had arrived. This only fueled the chaos and confusion. How was it possible that the ship had traveled so far in a matter of minutes? Back at the Philadelphia shipyard, after approximately 15 minutes of absence, the USS Eldridge reappeared in the same location from which it had disappeared. But the ship's return was only the beginning of a true nightmare. What should have been a successful experiment had turned into a disaster. The scene aboard the ship was horrifying. The first men to board the ship after its return witnessed a surreal sight. Some members of the crew were disoriented, wandering aimlessly and muttering incoherent words. Others were screaming in pain and agony, as if suffering from something incomprehensible. However, the most terrifying sight was what had happened to some of the sailors. Part of their bodies had fused with the ship's hull, as if their flesh had merged with the metal. Arms, legs, and torsos were permanently bonded to the structure of the ship, in a grotesque vision that seemed to defy the laws of physics and biology. The chaos aboard was absolute. The crew, who had previously followed strict military orders, were now unrecognizable. Many of those who were still conscious exhibited signs of profound psychological shock. The sight of their fellow sailors fused to the ship had shattered any sense of sanity. For some, what had happened aboard the USS Eldridge was worse than anything they could have imagined in combat. The scientists and officers, observing from the safety of the control room, were equally shocked. The experiment, which was supposed to represent a breakthrough in military technology, had now turned into a disaster of unforeseen proportions. Whatever had happened to the USS Eldridge during the minutes it disappeared had shattered the boundaries of human understanding. The results were beyond any rational explanation. The experiment had spiraled out of control, and no one knew how to handle the consequences. The question now was how to cover up what had just happened. The reappearance of the USS Eldridge was a moment of temporary relief, but what followed plunged everyone into unimaginable horror. For the scientists and officers overseeing the experiment, the ship's disappearance for about 15 minutes seemed to be the greatest success possible. until the true consequences began to emerge. When the ship returned to the Philadelphia port, it brought with it an even darker mystery. As the officers approached the ship, they quickly realized that something was terribly wrong. At first, the sailors aboard were confused, disoriented, and some were screaming as if they had witnessed something horrific. However, what awaited them was beyond any expectation or imagination. The crew of the USS Eldridge had not returned unscathed from the disappearance. Many had been affected in ways that defied any logical explanation. Upon boarding the ship, the rescuers were met with a terrifying sight. Some crew members were fused into the metal of the hull, as if their bodies had materialized within the very structure of the ship. Arms, legs, and torsos were partially incorporated into the metallic base, as if time and space around them had warped mercilessly. The sight was grotesque, resembling more the result of a macabre science fiction experiment than a real military advancement attempt. The silence that had settled over the port was shattered by the screams of pain and despair from those still conscious. The sailors who had not been fused to the ship were in a state of shock. Many wandered aimlessly across the deck, unable to recognize their comrades or respond to any commands. Some seemed trapped in a trance, while others mumbled incoherent words as if trying to grasp what had happened during the time they had been missing. For the scientists and Navy officers observing the scene, it was a nightmare unfolding before their eyes. They had embarked on an ambitious project, but no one could have predicted the catastrophic consequences that followed. The promise of making the ship invisible to radar had turned into something much worse. The USS Eldridge and its crew had been subjected to a physical anomaly that escaped human understanding. There was evidence that the ship had not only disappeared, but had also been teleported to another location, specifically to Norfolk, Virginia, before returning to the Philadelphia port. Witnesses in Norfolk reported seeing the ship appear briefly, shrouded in the same greenish-blue mist that surrounded it in Philadelphia. However, it vanished again after only a few minutes, reappearing at its original location. No one could explain how the Eldridge had traveled over 200 miles in such a short time, let alone comprehend the grotesque changes that had occurred to the crew. After the ship's return, Navy authorities quickly realized that much more was at stake than just the failure of an experiment. What had happened aboard the USS Eldridge threatened to expose the secret project, and it was crucial to keep everything under absolute secrecy. Doctors and specialists were called in to try and stabilize the surviving crew members, but many of them never returned to a normal state. Those who survived the experiment suffered from profound mental trauma, and the few who could speak about what they experienced during the disappearance recounted fragmented and disjointed memories of places and times that made no sense. The mystery surrounding the USS Eldridge and what had happened during its brief absence grew as the weeks passed. Official reports were quickly classified, and the U.S. government rushed to cover up any information that could reveal the true nature of the experiment. What had begun as an attempt at military advancement had turned into a nightmare they could never have foreseen. The repercussions of the experiment were not only physical, but also deeply psychological. Shortly after the reappearance of the USS Eldridge, it became evident that something profoundly disturbing had happened to the crew. The visible scars, the bodies fused into the metal, and the screams of pain were only the surface of a deeper abyss of suffering. The true impact of the experiment would reveal itself in the weeks and months that followed. Those who survived physically intact were far from mentally sound. The crew of the USS Eldridge once composed of disciplined men trained for the hardships of combat, had become a group of broken individuals exhibiting erratic behaviors and severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of the sailors were catatonic, unable to respond to external stimuli, while others displayed paranoid and violent tendencies. The trauma caused by what they experienced during the disappearance left irreversible psychological scars. Some of the crew members who managed to articulate their memories spoke of sensations of suffocation, as if they were submerged in a space without time or form. They reported seeing images of places that didn't exist, feeling trapped between different realities. The most frightening aspect was that these memories came in disjointed flashes, making it nearly impossible to establish a clear timeline of what actually happened during the minutes the ship was away from the port. Psychologists and doctors were called in to treat the survivors, but most diagnoses were inconclusive. The sailors' behavior defied conventional medical explanations. The government, however, had a different approach. Unable to cope with the magnitude of the failure and fearing that the incident might leak to the public, the Navy decided to silence those involved. Many of the crew members exhibiting signs of mental disturbance were placed in psychiatric institutions where they disappeared from headlines and public life. Among the most disturbing consequences was the state of displacement that some sailors experienced. There were reports of crew members vanishing for moments only to reappear in different locations, as if they were jumping between dimensions. In one particularly notable case, a sailor was seen walking across a room before disappearing completely, leaving his comrades in shock. He was never seen again. The physical effects were no less horrifying. Even those who had not been fused to the ship reported unusual symptoms. Some sailors complained of chronic pain, seemingly linked to the intense exposure to the electromagnetic field. Others exhibited signs of radiation sickness, despite no evidence of nuclear exposure during the experiment. It was as if the very bodies of the crew had been altered in ways that defied understanding. The Navy kept most of these reports under wraps, classifying the evidence and forbidding any official mention of the experiment. Military doctors involved in treating the sailors were instructed not to discuss their conditions with the press or with the families. The U.S. government was determined to bury the incident forever, treating it as a state secret, as the scientists involved in the experiment tried to find explanations for what had happened. The truth seemed to be lost in increasingly complex theories. Some believed that the electromagnetic field had torn through the barriers between different dimensions, while others suggested that the ship had traveled not just through space, but also through time. Regardless of the theory, one thing was clear. The USS Eldridge and its crew would never be the same. The nightmare of the Philadelphia experiment was not just a scientific failure, but also a human tragedy. One that left lasting scars on men who had been unwillingly forced to confront the unknown. What was meant to be a technological breakthrough had instead resulted in a tragedy, one the Navy was willing to keep secret at all costs. Immediately following the catastrophic failure of the experiment, it became clear to military leaders that the U.S. government needed to intervene swiftly to contain the disaster. What had started as an ambitious war technology project had turned into a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, and the terrible consequences for the crew and the ship demanded quick action. The cover-up wasn't just a convenient decision, but a necessity to ensure the public would never know what had occurred with the USS Eldridge. Within hours of the ship's reappearance, a series of orders were issued by the highest authorities in the Navy and the government. The first priority was to contain the information and prevent any possible leaks. The ship was immediately isolated, and everyone who had witnessed the experiment was placed under strict control. Engineers, scientists, and even shipyard workers were interrogated and warned of the importance of absolute secrecy. The operation was now treated as a state secret. At the same time, efforts to bury the story began. Official reports were altered or destroyed, and documents related to the experiment mysteriously vanished from Navy archives. The press, curious about the rumors that had begun circulating, was quickly pushed away, and any requests for information were denied under the pretext of national security. Every trace of the project was carefully removed, and the official narrative became clear. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened at the Philadelphia shipyard that day. The surviving crew members were not spared from the cover-up either. Many of the men who were still conscious were sent to military psychiatric facilities, isolated from the outside world. Their stories, marked by deep trauma and indescribable experiences, were dismissed as delusions caused by war stress. Those who insisted on speaking about what they had witnessed were publicly discredited, their accounts labeled as the product of severe mental disturbances. One of the more sinister aspects of the cover-up was the fate of the scientists involved in the experiment. While some were instructed to remain silent, others were relocated to other top-secret projects or simply disappeared from public view. Nikola Tesla, who was allegedly involved in the initial development of the technology used in the experiment, died shortly afterward under circumstances that further fueled conspiracy theories. Einstein, on the other hand, never directly commented on his involvement, and his alleged participation remained shrouded in speculation. As the weeks turned into months, the efforts to cover up intensified. The government not only suppressed evidence, but also began creating a disinformation campaign. Small details about the project were leaked in a controlled manner, just enough to confuse the curious, but never enough to give substance to suspicions. False documents were created to divert attention, and whenever someone tried to investigate further, they only found contradictory or incomplete information. Meanwhile, rumors about what really happened to the USS Eldridge began circulating among the public, fueled by anonymous witnesses and the mystery surrounding the experiment. Some claimed the ship had vanished completely, while others said it had been teleported. Conspiracy theorists began raising questions about the government's true intentions and the military secrets being hidden. The U.S. Navy, faced with the disaster, adopted a stance of absolute denial. Any mention of the experiment was refuted, and all official records indicated that the USS Eldridge had carried out standard wartime missions during that period, with no involvement in experimental scientific activities. When questioned, Navy officials described the experiment as an urban myth or a misunderstanding created by people with little knowledge of military procedures. Despite all efforts to conceal the truth, the mystery surrounding the Philadelphia experiment never entirely disappeared. Over the years, new theories emerged, and those who had been silenced began to be seen as martyrs of a grand government conspiracy. Even with the lack of concrete evidence, the fascination with the experiment continued to grow, fueled by the desire to know what really happened on that fateful day in October 1943. The government's cover-up may have succeeded in burying the facts, but doubt and mystery surrounding the USS Eldridge remained alive, provoking the imagination and fear of future generations. What began as an attempt to hide a military failure transformed into one of the largest and most persistent conspiracy theories in modern history. Despite the U.S. government's extensive efforts to silence the truth about what happened to the USS Eldridge, the events of that day never disappeared from the collective consciousness. On the contrary, as more information was hidden, curiosity and speculation only grew. The mystery surrounding the Philadelphia experiment ended up fueling conspiracy theories that remain alive to this day, decades after the event. The first theories began circulating soon after the incident, as rumors about the experiment leaked. Shipyard workers in Philadelphia, some engineers involved, and even relatives of crew members started spreading confused and contradictory accounts of what they had seen or heard. Each story seemed more fantastic than the last, but all shared a central truth. The USS Eldridge had disappeared and returned in a way that defied known science. One of the most popular theories that emerged right after the experiment was that the USS Eldridge had not only become invisible, but had also teleported. Rumors that the ship had been briefly spotted in Norfolk, Virginia, hundreds of miles away, fueled this speculation. According to this theory, the experiment accidentally involved teleportation technology, allowing the ship to travel from one point to another in a matter of minutes. Proponents of this theory point to the idea that the electromagnetic field generated during the experiment could have created a tear in space-time. Supposedly, this allowed the USS Eldridge and its crew to cross the vast distance between Philadelphia and Norfolk instantaneously. Although scientists at the time considered this idea ridiculous, the theory persisted, capturing the popular imagination and being incorporated into various science fiction stories. Another branch of conspiracy theories that gained traction was the possibility that the experiment had tampered not only with space, but also with time. Some speculated that the USS Eldridge, upon disappearing, had not only traveled to another location, but also to another period. This theory was based on the fragmented and confused accounts of the survivors, who seemed to describe images or experiences outside known reality. The idea that the ship had traveled to a different time, even briefly, intrigued both conspiracy theorists and amateur scientists. For proponents of this theory, the electromagnetic field generated around the ship was strong enough to create a distortion in time, something many saw as a revolutionary scientific discovery, if it were true. The possibility of time travel, even accidental, opened a new level of speculation and expanded the legend of the Philadelphia experiment. In addition to teleportation and time manipulation, a third and even more fantastical theory suggested that the USS Eldridge had been projected into a parallel dimension. According to this hypothesis, the ship not only physically disappeared from the port, but was transported to an alternate reality where the laws of physics might be different. The reports of crew members fused to the ship's metal and sailors disappearing briefly after the Eldridge's return seemed to support this idea. To some, these were signs that the ship had slipped between different dimensions, and when it returned, it bore the scars of a reality that should never have been accessed. The parallel dimension theory resonated with those who believed the US government was secretly experimenting with the multiverse. Naturally, all these theories of teleportation, time travel, and parallel dimensions fed into a broader belief that the government was hiding important discoveries. Conspiracy theorists believed the Philadelphia incident was just the tip of the iceberg, and that the US government had continued conducting secret experiments with advanced, perhaps even alien technology. For conspiracy believers, the government's silence was proof that something extraordinary had indeed occurred and was being kept from public knowledge. This line of thought gained even more traction when reports of other secret experiments began circulating. Speculation grew over the decades, with people suggesting that the Philadelphia experiment was somehow connected to other mysterious projects, such as the Roswell incident or secret operations around Area 51. There is also a theory, supported by some conspiracy scholars, that part of the leaked information about the experiment was deliberately planted by the government as a disinformation strategy. According to this hypothesis, the government encouraged certain outlandish versions of the events to discredit any serious investigation attempts. That way, the more absurd the theory, the less credibility would be given to the incident as a whole. This disinformation strategy would be an effective way to bury the truth under layers of ridiculous and exaggerated stories, making it impossible to distinguish fact from fiction. For the more skeptical, this would be the real conspiracy. Not what happened to the USS Eldridge, but how the government manipulated public perception of the events. Regardless of which theory people choose to believe, the Philadelphia experiment has become one of the most persistent and mysterious stories in American popular culture. Whether viewed as a scientific anomaly or a government conspiracy, the incident continues to fuel speculation to this day, defying simple explanations and leaving a permanent mark on the collective imagination. The Philadelphia experiment raises profound questions about the limits of human knowledge and how far science can go before crossing boundaries that we cannot control. What began as a seemingly simple experiment to make a ship invisible ended up touching on phenomena beyond comprehension, involving concepts like teleportation, time manipulation, and possibly even parallel dimensions. The attempt to use science as a tool of war, pushing the boundaries of what is possible, challenged the very laws of nature. By experimenting with electromagnetic fields on such a massive scale, the scientists involved likely didn't fully grasp the risks. Although the unified field theory was revolutionary and promising, the experiment revealed that there are consequences when we try to manipulate forces we don't yet fully understand. What happened aboard the USS Eldridge serves as a warning about the dangers of exploring the unknown. In attempting to master invisibility, American scientists and military personnel seemingly opened the door to consequences that no one could have foreseen. The grotesque fusion of sailors' bodies with the ship's metal and the crew's mental collapse are evidence that the forces involved in the experiment were beyond human control. Beyond the physical and psychological dangers faced by the crew, the experiment raises ethical questions about the limits of scientific experimentation, especially when human lives are at stake. How far are we willing to push in the name of progress? What are the moral boundaries of such advancements? And what happens when the pursuit of power and control outweighs the consideration for the safety and well-being of those involved? The case of the Philadelphia experiment highlights a dilemma that still resonates today. Scientific advancement often goes hand in hand with incalculable risks. The very nature of human knowledge is to push boundaries and discover what lies beyond what we know. However, this pursuit comes with the responsibility of recognizing our limitations and carefully weighing the costs. Had the experiment succeeded, it could have changed the course of the war forever. But the price paid by those aboard the USS Eldridge was tragically high. In the end, the Philadelphia experiment forces us to reflect on the consequences of proceeding with experimental science without fully considering the implications. How far should we go in our search for answers? What is the true cost of manipulating the laws of physics? And how far can we stretch these laws before they turn against us? The story, shrouded in mystery and conspiracy, remains a powerful reminder that while science is an incredible force for good, it can also be an instrument of destruction when misunderstood or misused. The Philadelphia experiment, despite its official details being deeply concealed or discredited by the government, remains one of the most persistent and fascinating legends of contemporary history. Even decades later, the story is told, retold, and adapted in books, films, and TV shows. The incident has become a true piece of popular culture, evoking a sense of mystery, danger, and the eternal search for answers to the unknown. Part of the enduring fascination with the Philadelphia experiment lies in the combination of real science, such as unified field theory and World War II technologies, with more fantastical elements like teleportation and space-time manipulation. This fusion of historical facts with science fiction creates an irresistible narrative, capable of capturing the imagination of multiple generations. The idea that the government could be involved in such extraordinary and dangerous experiments taps into humanity's desire for revolutionary discoveries, while also evoking a deep fear of the unknown. Various films and documentaries, like the famous The Philadelphia Experiment, 1984, brought the story to the big screen, exploring the consequences of a failed experiment that distorts reality. These films, in addition to being popular, have perpetuated the myth, leading new generations to question the truth behind the legend. As a result, the Philadelphia incident has solidified itself as part of the rich tapestry of American conspiracy theories, alongside stories like the Roswell case and Area 51. The experiment's legacy also resonates among conspiracy theorists, many of whom see the case as a symbol of the government's attempts to hide shocking secrets from the public. The secrecy surrounding what happened, combined with the disturbing reports of disappearances and physical distortions, has fueled new theories linking the incident to other top-secret military projects. On the other hand, the scientific community views the Philadelphia experiment with skepticism. Many dismiss the story as a product of collective imagination, fueled by scientific misunderstandings and media sensationalism. Still, the mystery persists, and the fact that the U.S. Navy has never released a detailed explanation feeds the belief that something out of the ordinary did happen. More than just an urban legend, the Philadelphia experiment highlights humanity's desire to explore the unknown and the eternal tension between scientific innovation and the fear of unforeseen consequences. As the story continues to evolve, it remains a powerful narrative, reflecting our hopes, fears, and unease with technological advances that challenge the laws of nature. Even without concrete evidence, the popular fascination with the Philadelphia experiment shows no signs of fading, keeping the story alive as a perpetual enigma passed down from generation to generation.